Let's jump into this first segment. It is our marriage strategy of the week.
Yes, this week's strategy is to safeguard against grudges by shutting down assumptions and clearly communicating. And this is so powerful because oftentimes this is what we deal with on a daily basis as a married couple, especially when we first get married. There's a lot of expectations that we've placed on our spouse
We're not
that
communicated.
that's not communicated, and we just assume that it's going to happen. But you can't do that because you have two different individuals coming from two different backgrounds, and you have to clearly communicate with that person what your expectations are. And maybe those expectations are unrealistic, and hearing the other person's perception as to, why they do what they do and how they function. And that means that you have to have those open lines of communication. And if you don't, you will create those grudges and those offenses, and it will trickle into other areas of your marriage, and it will just cause a lot of issues.
I want you to kind of explain how we came about this and read. There's a quote that Victoria came across, and it sort of triggered this conversation between us about how couples develop grudges or offenses towards their spouses. And go ahead and read the quote.
Well, what I found was a quote that said, "Before you hold a grudge, hold a conversation. It may be a result of a misunderstanding." And it just kind of clicked for me because I know that this is a challenge for all of us that deal with relationships on a daily basis. It doesn't necessarily have to be your spouse. It could be friendships, it could be, family. When, we see somebody look us a certain way, or they might have made a statement, and we've automatically taken in those conversations and start negotiating in our head with the enemy of all the things that could have been, or maybe they have meant when they said those statements or when they did those actions. And then we create things in our minds that actually never existed, versus let's confront this head on and let's hold a conversation. I'm not saying, approaching this person in a domineering way and start accusing them, start attacking them, because that's just not going to be effective at all.
Right.
But I think your feelings are valid if you are feeling a specific way. We've often said, if you do get to a place where you feel like every time that you have a conversation, you get defensive, it may be better for you to get a journal and write out what your feelings are. And then I think that will help to kind of keep you in check, is are those feelings valid, or you're overreacting?
Right.
And so once you test that out and say, okay, those feelings are valid and I need to address it with this person, and just sit down with them and say, I don't want to come across as I'm attacking you, but this is how I feel, and I want to have some kind of a resolution. And I just wanted to have a conversation about, how I feel about this specific situation, about what you said or what you did. And allow that person to explain themselves, because more than likely it is going to be a misunderstanding of some sort. Maybe they did not mean it the way they did, or maybe they didn't know that action or those words actually hurt your feelings. So,
or if your feelings are valid and those assumptions turn out to be true, then you'll be able to confront whatever issue is there. Assumption is sort of the root of most of couples' offenses. And you can feel when your spouse has withdrawn. Even if they're not telling you, you know that something is different. Their posture toward you has changed. And so a lot of these assumptions are coming from family, friends, invasive thoughts. Spiritual warfare, Dr. Cindy Trim says, is the counsel of the human mind with any other spirit other than the Spirit of God. So that could be other individuals who you're counseling with, who put thoughts in your head, or it could just be the whispers of the enemy, these intrusive thoughts that come in that you latch hold of and begin to create this narrative about your spouse, that even if there is a salt grain's worth of truth in that assumption, right? You have now built this entire narrative around it and exploded this idea about your spouse in your head to the point where you have now believed something about them that isn't true. And so you have to, and I'm a very methodical person, you have to confront these thoughts head on. And so we've come up with these 3 points to be able to help you navigate intrusive thoughts that become assumptions, which form grudges and offenses that you have towards your spouse. Whenever you have a thought that begins to offend you, a grudge about your spouse, I want you to start off with number 1, giving them the benefit of the doubt. Give them the benefit of the doubt. I heard this quote from a men's group that I was in, and I'm not sure where it came from, but it was a quote that says, "I'm going to view this in a light most favorable to you." And so even when your spouse is talking to you in regular communication, oftentimes we don't understand the context. And even when we hear something from them, we assume that it's rooted in a certain place, but it may not always be. So the best thing for you to do is right off the bat, instead of accusing them or believing the worst about them, give them the benefit of the doubt and say to yourself, I'm going to view this in a light most favorable to them. All right? Number 2, you're going to seek clarity and not condemnation. So after you give them the benefit of the doubt, you still have these questions. But the goal is not to condemn them and find them guilty. The goal is clarity, to understand. So you're going to have to ask yourself some questions. Did I have the wrong expectations? Maybe they didn't live up to those expectations, but maybe it's because those expectations were not communicated. Number 2, did we have a clear agreement? Even if you express expectations, it doesn't mean your spouse agrees with those and the terms and conditions that you've laid out before them.
Just because they listen to your conversation doesn't mean that they agree. I often notice that, especially I think with women, if they express something that they have on their heart, like you need to help me with this, it doesn't mean that a husband's like, oh, okay, she told me this, so now I'm going to jump up and do everything and kind of guess what it is that she wants me to help with. I think you have to be very clear as to what that expectation is, what do you need him to do, what the time frame is, and like Ryan said, set the parameters, and then have the spouse say, okay, I am agreeing to this and I'll do it.
And we don't think that we have to be that specific, but we give ourselves, all of us, excuses not to do things that are either uncomfortable or inconvenient. And so we oftentimes will create ambiguous statements to be able to safeguard ourselves in the future from the responsibility and accountability with what it is that's been presented to us. Like if our spouse wants us to do something, and we'll give a generalized statement that kind of leans toward agreement, but not a specific type of agreement. And then if they come irritated, we say, well, I never agreed to that, right? I thought it was going to be this, right? And we almost use assumption as a shield instead of taking responsibility. Well, grown-ups, we get very specific and we understand what the expectations are, and we either agree or we don't. There's no gray areas. And so that number 2, seeking clarity, is important, but not seeking condemnation. You're not seeking to try and demonize your spouse and point fingers at them. You just want to seek clarity. And finally, with seeking clarity, I love this question. Does this assumption reflect what I know to be the heart of my spouse? You've known them since the time you were dating. You've been married X amount of years. Does this assumption that has come into your mind reflect the heart that you know them to have over the years that you have known them? Does this reflect their character, their nature? Is that assumption grounded in reality? And finally, the third point in this is to talk it out. Choose a favorable time to talk with your spouse and discuss the clarifying questions that you've asked yourself ahead of time. So let's start over at the top. Number 1, when these invasive thoughts come in, you start assuming things, you start building this narrative, you've gained an offense, a grudge toward your spouse. I want you to first give them the benefit of the doubt. I'm going to view this in a light most favorable to them. Number 2, seek clarity and not condemnation. Ask yourself those questions about expectations. Number 3, talk it out. Choose a time to intentionally sit down with your spouse and deal with those assumptions head on. And so I know that this was a little bit more in depth than we normally do for a marriage strategy, but I think it is a heavy topic. It's a place where the enemy drives a wedge is in assumptions. And so that's your marriage strategy of the week. Any final thoughts?
No, go ahead and apply it. Start journaling, start making sure that you keep yourself in check before you jump in to have those conversations that are not going to be productive. What we're really trying to do is give you guys these pointers and tips in order for your conversations to be productive and for you to act like a mature adult. And that will really help you to reel yourself in before you address it in a mature way with your spouse.
Yes.